All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you guys all had a nice break and managed to survive the cold without too much fuss or hassle. And if any of you have any friends or family in the Texas area, I hope that they're okay and doing okay. I know I had a couple of friends who made it through but lost power, but you know, that's real what they're going for, and thankfully we didn't have nearly as bad here. So um, other than that, I hope you guys are rested and ready for what's going to amount to be the push from now towards the end of the or towards summer. We'll be going for 6 straight weeks. We have a lot to cover. We have a lot to do, and I think that where the break fell in this semester actually serves our purposes really, really well. So what are we starting with tonight? Tonight we are jumping into our discussion of the lit review. We are going to on Moodle. It says that we just have this 1 week for the lit review or for discussion of the lit review, but chances are that'll probably bleed into next week as well. But from here through spring break, basically, I think what's going to end up happening is we will be covering kind of piece by piece the major components of the literature review and the method section. Why we have each piece, what goes into each piece, what each of those pieces are going to look like, and what we really want you to be working on and thinking about as you begin to write those 2 sections for your final paper. And then once we get through those 2 major components, we should be, well, we'll be coming back from spring break, but at that point, we'll be ready to finish up with presentation. So already be thinking about, or make sure that you're in good position to be beginning to read research and synthesize that research for this project. I'd say by next week, kind of at the latest. You really want to make sure, or we want to make sure that you guys have a topic, that you are comfortable with that topic, and have begun to find literature that goes along with that topic. All right. Before we get started, any logistics or housekeeping questions from any of you guys? I don't think I have anything major that I need to refer to.
Is there any way to access the recordings from Dr. G's class?
Yeah, they should all be on that same YouTube page. If you, let me see, if I go to that now. And I am seeing that this link just has my 3. 1 second. Let's see what's going on with that. Okay. Yeah. That should be there. I thought that was there. I may have looked at 547. I will make sure that we both get that up there ASAP. All right. Sorry about that. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, cool. We are going to start tonight with about 5 minutes of a breakout session. And I want you guys to be able to start to, or have a brief conversation with each other, and just about what you think the purpose of a literature review is. That's where we're going to start. All right. So what do you think the purpose of a lit review is? Easy enough question. Sound good? 5 minutes, putting you guys in those rooms, and I will see you shortly. Got it, Ashley?
I think a lot of what we talked about, it's already been discussed by the others. It gives you an overview of everything that, not everything, but the things that worked in other experiments, and how it can give you first a broad overview of all of it, and then kind of get to specifics of different parts of the dependent or independent variable, that how they worked in different experiments.
Awesome. I really, really, really like that, Ashley. And I'm going to be coming back to that. But what I like that your group sounds like you guys talked about was, it's not just a summary of the whole thing, but it's an opportunity to focus in on different components that you want to look at. Maybe you're doing a study that involves a tricky design, right? You might need to rely on another study that has used a similar design to give weight and credence to your design itself. You don't care what their dependent variable was. You don't care what their independent variable was. You don't care what their outcome was. You just want to show, like, look, I took this one specific component of a study and I'm adding this into my lit review because it's meaningful to my current study. And we'll be coming back to that idea of meaningfulness a lot. Excellent. Group 4, what did you guys come up with? Who's group 4? I know for a fact that there was a group 4.
I don't really remember what group I was.
If group 4 was the last group, so if no one from your group has gone yet, then you're up. Go ahead, Christine.
Kind of besides what everyone else has already said, usually at the end of the lit review, you can describe the purpose of your paper and like what you're doing specifically.
Excellent. Good. So what I want from those 4 synopses, what I want you guys to be thinking about is, there are the components of a lit review that are very, very obvious, right? And everyone does those things. It's those other components. Each of those 4 groups mentioned at least one thing that was not in the other 3 groups. But everything that was said becomes the hallmark of a good lit review. It's very important to understand that a lit review is more than just a summary of research on a like topic or a similar topic. A lit review builds a story. A lit review informs a reader or a listener about all of the major components that are going to be meaningful, that are going to be significant in the current study, right? There's one particular word, and what Christine alluded to with that kind of culminating paragraph, there's one particular word that you are doing throughout the lit review that builds or leads to that paragraph that describes what you are going to be doing in your study. I'll give you one hint. It starts with an S. Does anyone know what word I am thinking of? It's an important word to understand or to know from when you're talking about a lit review. It starts with an S.
Significance?
No. I appreciate the shot. The word is synthesis.
Oh, my guess started with a D, so I was like, no.
It's Monday, we're tired.
Okay, never mind.
The word is synthesis. When you are reviewing your studies, you are not just regurgitating. You are not just summarizing. That probably would have been the more obvious S word. You are not just summarizing the articles that you've read, the research that you have read. You are actually what we call synthesizing the research. What what does that mean to you guys? If I say that your lit review is the purpose of your lit review is to synthesize previous research, what does that mean to you guys? Does that mean anything to you guys?
I think it would be like piecing it together or like
Okay.
making or connecting the dots between prior research to what you're finding.
Excellent. I love that. Very nice, Aaron. So think about it this way. If you are if you're writing a story and you have just like character 1, character 2, setting 1, setting 2, plot, boom, boom, boom. And it's just one thing, then the next thing, then the next thing. And there are no transition sentences. There's no story building. There's no detail added, right? One is summarizing the main ideas, right? I summarize who the characters are, what the setting is, what the plot is, what the conclusion is. But there's no story. You don't actually have a story. So if I am writing a lit review and I say in experiment 1, yada, 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 did X, Y, and Z. In experiment 2, these other people did A, B, and C. In experiment 3, these other people did 1, 2, and 3. That doesn't tell me anything. What am I, as I'm reading that, what am I looking for? What am I trying to understand? Why are you presenting these studies to me? It's incumbent on us, the writer, to draw that, to connect those dots and to draw that line going from the educational theory, right? The theory through the seminal article for whatever it is that you have identified a seminal article for, through the current research to your culminating paragraph, right? There are, for those of you who are just starting, I guarantee you will see this. For those of you who have been around a while, you have more than likely seen this, some sort of comment on your lit reviews regarding like needs more transition, needs more flow in your lit review, right? And that has to do with the idea that in your lit reviews, and you're doing the kind of the most critical of variables, but that's kind of it, where you're summarizing, right? But when you summarize an article, you give me the information, but you don't tell me what is significant about that information. It's rare that the significance of any one article that you are reviewing lies in just the outcome, right? There are always other pieces of information that we need to make sure we include in our summaries so that we can tie study A to B to C to D, all right? So when we sit down to do a literature review, our goal should be to take all this information from all these studies, know what we think our problem is, know what we think our solution is going to be, our study, right? And we need to draw the path. We need to draw the line from beginning to end in a meaningful way for our reader, all right? There are lots of different ways to do that. There are lots of different structures to a lit review. There's lots of different ways to purpose your lit review. There's a lot of different ways to get from A to B. Tonight, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about some of the various structures that we commonly see in our lit review as they relate to the different types of studies that we are doing. And I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the summary of an individual article and what should go into that summary, but probably more importantly, what you should get out of that summary, okay? All right. First thing to know about a lit review is the challenge, the hardest thing that you are going to do while writing a lit review is understanding, I think, understanding the balance between dissemination of fact and interpretation of that fact. All right. As a rule of thumb, there is very little original thought that should go into a lit review. So what do I mean by that? At a basic level, anything that you state as fact needs to have a citation. All right. Everything that has a truth to it needs to have a citation. You cannot say this problem exists. You have to say who says this problem exists, where do they say it? All right. That's the one half of your lit review. The second half of your lit review, not weighted equally, is your synthesis, your analysis of those facts. All right. This is challenging because you are drawing conclusions without any new data. Authors have already interpreted their data. They've already discussed their data. The field, by and large, for studies that are really out there, have had time to digest that interpretation and those data and make an informed and database opinion on that. So where does your analysis come in a lit review? Where are you able to inject your thoughts? I don't want to say opinions yet, but your thoughts on the data. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways, the primary way, is through this idea of synthesis. Okay. So if I have 3 studies that are written individually, right? I have study 1 on an observational learning procedure, study 2 on a different observational learning procedure, and study 3 on yet a third observational learning procedure. All right. My job in synthesis is not to necessarily take the author's own discussion and the next author's discussion and the next author's discussion and summarize those. But my job is to say, given all 3 of these things, what does that mean? How is that significant? How do I take the full body of research and synthesize it into a single point, right? Now, what can those points be? Those points can be evaluative. Study A is stronger than study B or C, and I'm out to prove that or add strength to that. I can say that study A provides some benefit in these circumstances, study B in these circumstances, study C in these circumstances, and I want to compare. I want to accumulate. I want to put them all together. I want to do, what do I want to do with that information? That is your synthesis. That is your opportunity to take fact that you have cited and put your own, it's not spin, it's not opinion, but it's thought of usefulness into one point. And that point should in some way, shape, or form be in your study. Right? So we are taking all the different components, all the meaningful components of our study, and those kind of become the branches of our literature review. All right. So whether it's dependent variable, independent variable, outcome, design, population, setting, whatever is significant for your study, those become the tentacles of your lit review, each of which needs its own summaries and its own synthesis. Put all together, you synthesize those different components into your current study. All right, does that make sense? You guys see that? Cool. All right, so given that framework of what we do in a lit review, how do we do that? How do we go from problem to solution? Well, lots of different ways, lots of different ways to look at it in general. All right, so let's start with a buzzword of lit reviews that I think is important and can have different levels of significance, and that's the seminal study. All right, so what is the seminal study? The seminal study is, and I'm not starting at the beginning of the lit review, but I'm starting with a piece that I know that we're going to end up getting through really, really quickly. So the seminal study is the first article on a particular topic. That's simple. All right, so you could have a seminal study on positive reinforcement. You could have a seminal study on token economies. You could have a seminal study on the Premack principle. You could have a seminal study on every tactic, every principle, every protocol. All of these have firsts. At some point, someone had an idea that no one had before about how to do something, and they wrote a study on it. Okay, so in some way, shape, or form, all lit reviews are going to flow through this concept of a seminal study. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, does anyone have a seminal study that sticks out to them that you refer to regularly in your lit reviews?
I've probably tried to read Horn and Lowe's on naming probably about 500 times, and I still feel like I'm still understanding bits and pieces of it. But
yeah, I'm in the same boat. I mean that's one of the hardest articles I've ever written. It's obviously very, very impactful, and you'll be talking about that throughout. But yeah, anytime you write anything related to naming, Horn and Lowe 1996 gets thrown in there, right? Good. Anyone have anything else? I'll tell you mine. The seminal study on a task analysis. I don't even remember who wrote it anymore. Has anyone read that study? It's like 27 steps on how to brush your teeth. It's like 1969, 70, 71, something like that. That's like the seminal study. And it's so crazy to me with these articles that like we do task analyses all day, every day, right? But someone was the first person to put all the steps down and use that as a specific tactic for behavior change. And I think that that's so cool. And the fact that it was something like brushing your teeth, that idea, seminal studies. So I guess what I'm going for here is that take those two articles, right? Task analysis, Horn and Lowe naming. Those couldn't be further apart in terms of complexity, right? Horn and Lowe is this overly complicated conceptual article, and whoever wrote the task analysis article listed a bunch of steps in a chain and used that as a tactic. Like that's really, really, really basic, but it's so significant. So what role does the seminal article play in our lit review? Well, it depends, right? In Horn and Lowe, you don't need to summarize the totality of Horn and Low anytime you write on naming. Good luck to you if you do. I can't do it. It's too much, it's too big. Not all of it is salient to your practice. So even though that's the seminal study, you don't have to overly indulge yourself in summarizing it. In the task analysis article, that article holds up just as well today as an example of a task analysis as it did 50 years ago, right? So that very well might be your use of the seminal article there, to fully summarize and use that to synthesize or to build your synthesis. So while we throw around this idea of the seminal article a lot, I don't want you to think that you have to find and understand and use and base your study around the seminal article, all right? What the seminal article does is it serves as the cornerstone of whatever it is that you are doing, all right? There are plenty of tactics, there are plenty of concepts, there are plenty of ideas in behavior analysis as well as in all of scientific thought that are the ideas are significant, but the studies themselves are no longer practically meaningful. And when that's the case, that's okay. You don't have to review, you don't have to summarize something that doesn't hold significance today, right? If you are an astronomer, you don't need to cite Copernicus in your studies, right? There is seminal data that are not relevant to the current the current interests, right? How many of you have either written a literature review on conditioning or read an article on conditioning? Most of you, right? Okay. Did you read the name Pavlov in there? Some yes, but others probably not. Yes, in your Psych 101 textbook, you read that name, but Pavlov isn't cited in every single conditioning study, right? So there's not going to be this critical need to go back to the most basic form of all of these ideas. And I don't want you to think that you have to, but the concepts are going to run through, okay? All right, so let's talk structure a little bit. Keeping in mind that there is this idea of the seminal article. How do we go from start to end? How do we get there? Through a couple of different paths. What do you start off with in a lit review? What is the opening paragraph going to be?
Problem?
Okay. What how do you phrase that problem? How do you hang on one second? How you don't say my problem is, right? What is the language? What is the syntax of your statement of the problem in a lit review? And obviously it's different for everyone, but how are you presenting this?
Is it like the introduction to maybe like the verbal behavior you're going to discuss?
Good. Okay. Can you expand on that at all? I want to assume that I know what you're saying, but go further.
So like if we're tackling maybe like, so for listener immersion, one of the articles they first talked about like the importance of the listener fluency or repertoires.
Great. Awesome. So what I'm getting from that is you're almost starting off by saying that there is a thing, it is important, and not everybody has it. Right? That's your problem right there. Listener skills are a thing. They are significant. There are children who do not naturally acquire listener repertoires. Boom. You have a problem. Right? Now, what's the challenge in that opening paragraph?
Captivating the reader.
That's one problem for sure. You have to be interesting right from the start. What's the second problem? Right from the start. Listener behavior is a thing. Says who? Listener behavior is important. Says who? Not everyone develops a listener repertoire. Says who? Right from the start, you have to have citations. Right from the start, you have to establish that someone has looked at this thing and someone has established there's data around that thing. All right. If you are studying something new, if you are studying something that has never been studied before, you don't get to start with that thing because that thing has not been established. One of the challenging things about the dissertation process is you are working from a place that no one has been before. So you don't have the ability to start off by saying, here's what everyone else says about the thing, right? Then it wouldn't be novel research. Then it wouldn't be something new. Okay. So in your lit reviews, when I say original research, I mean, brand new ideas, brand new theories, brand new principles or tactics, right? In your research where you're focusing on replication, you're focusing on expansion of current research, someone has said something about everything that you have done. That process that Heidi just walked us through, that's your educational theory. That's where does my problem exist and what data support that it is an actual problem. Okay. How many of you were challenged by that activity, that educational theory activity? It's tough, right? It's tough because we are used to thinking about what this is something I said in the initial class. We are used to thinking of problems in terms of the client in front of us or the student in front of us. We are not used to thinking of problems in terms of a theoretical base of that problem. But every intervention, every tactic that we have has a theoretical problem. Something exists, it's important, and not everybody has it. All right. Token economy. Positive reinforcement is a thing. It is important. It's not salient for everybody. The positive reinforcers that we are using are not salient for everybody. So we use tokens to make them more salient. All right. Naming. Fast learning is a thing. Fast learning is important. Not everybody does it. That's a gross oversimplification. Observational learning. Learning by watching others is a thing. It's important. Not everybody does it. All right. That structure is your educational theory. That structure gives you a problem to explore. All right. Then from there, okay, what does everybody else say about observational learning? And right from the start, once we've established what that problem is, and we've established where that problem has been identified, we are in a position where we can jump right into the research. All right. But and this is hard to do in a lit review because a lit review is linear. Sorry, writing is linear on physically on paper, but a lit review has those tentacles, right? So we have to keep these ideas organized for people. Has anyone ever written a flow chart for a lit review before? Try that. Do that. Organize your thoughts in a non-linear way. That can be, you know, a circle getting back to where we started. That can that can be like a one sec. This will be way easier. That can be whatever this kind of chart would be, so on and so forth. It can be something like this, where you're flowing around and back down, but try to diagram how your lit review is actually going to flow in three-dimensional space, all right? Because you've gone from this one problem to now what? Where do I start? Do I start talking about dependent variables? Do I start talking about independent variables? Do I go to the seminal article? Do I go to the current research? What do I do, right? And in the physically linear structure of English writing, of Western writing, that can be really, really challenging, all right? So you have to have organized what are the different components of your study that need to be observed, that need to be reviewed, that need to be synthesized, all right? Starting, what I would recommend in general is starting with the more concrete and less complex components. Work your way through your study. If it is so straightforward that it's taken as a given, it's not something that needs to be reviewed. You don't always have to cite some other study's design as justification for your current design if you're doing a multiple probe across participants. It is generally agreed that that is an effective way to show A, B, and C. But if you are using that design to show something novel, then yeah, you may want to include that. I wouldn't recommend that be the first thing though. All right. So what are some of the components of your study that you may want to establish through literature? What are some of the ideas, and be thinking about, I know we're jumping a few weeks ahead, but be thinking about the components of a method section. What are some components that you may want to establish as valid and meaningful through the discussion of in a lit review? What do you guys think?
The independent and dependent variables and
Great.
the relationship.
Yeah, so we want to know, are the dependent variables a thing that have been studied before? And if so, what do people say about them? Are the independent variables things that have been studied before? And what do people say about them, right? You will almost always have to rely on one of those two pieces. I say almost always have to because I haven't put any thought into this statement, but I can't think of anything that would demonstrate otherwise. But you will have to rely on one of either the dependent or independent variable being validated prior to your study. Okay. If not, then you're doing, at minimum, doing two studies. One should be to validate a dependent variable. The second to validate an independent variable. All right. But you need to either know, is the thing you are studying valid, or is the thing that you are using to induce valid. Otherwise, you have two unknowns. All right. My dissertation looked at conditioned seeing as a behavior. All right. There had previously not been any data on conditioned seeing as a behavior. Skinner wrote about it theoretically, but no one had collected any data on it. My first challenge was showing in some way that conditioned seeing was a thing at all. I couldn't even think about an intervention until I could show that people emitted this behavior that fit the definition that Skinner had proposed, right? Until I did that, there was no intervention to be had. Most times when we're talking about interventions, we're talking about working with previously validated dependent variables. We're working with measures of things that have already been done or can easily be done. But you take something like what Heidi said with listener behavior. If you've never looked at listener behavior before, or a listener repertoire, how do you establish that a listener repertoire is a thing? How do you do that? If you are the seminal author there, how do you establish that listener behavior is a thing? Any ideas? What you might do? It's hard for you guys to think about because it's ingrained in the current studies that we have and the current protocols that we have, right? We take a behavior and we see if we can do it to rate, right? That dependent variable has to be established that it is a thing. So maybe we find some students and we give them a set of 20 listener directions to respond to, and we see how long it takes them. When they take another group of students and we say, we give them the same 20 directions and we see how long it takes them. Well, it took this first group of students 5 minutes to do those 20 directions, and it took the second group of students 30 seconds to do those 20 directions. One of these groups is clearly behaving in a different way than the other of these groups. So I'm going to operationally define that second group as student or individuals with a listener repertoire, and that first group as individuals without. But not until I establish that there are these differences can I begin to have an intervention that says, and we can do something about it. All right. So most of the time, we are working with established dependent variables, behaviors that we can measure, that we understand, and we're looking at tweaks and changes to independent variables. We're looking at how can we take this little intervention and do something different and see if we still have an effect. All right. But we're using established behaviors, dependent variables. The other way to look at it is an established independent variable. And we want to see if this independent variable has an effect on these previously unstudied dependent variables. So in that direction, we would focus on what does the research say this independent variable has or has not done in the past. And we would make some assumptions and some leaps and jumps to say, and I'm going to see if it also does this. All right. So in studying the dependent or reviewing the dependent and independent variables, we are trying to show our readers what has already been validated, what do others say is already an established reasonable use of the thing that I am then going to build upon. That makes sense? I'm seeing some couple of blank stares. Feel good about that? Go ahead, Maddie.
What? Sorry, I've been like holding on to this question and like trying to answer it while you're like going over it. So you were explaining how, so if you have to prove that there's a thing, like I read your dissertation on conditioned seeing, and that was like the first experiment. You had to go through that before you could do your intervention. Like, would you have to analyze between typically developing and non-typically developing kids to be able to see that, or do you
No.
not always have to have that?
Absolutely not. So the groups that you study for that establishment can be the same demographic. They can be different demographics. They can be different within the same. But you need to be able to show in a way that is meaningful to you that there are differences in groups. So if our study seeks to show, actually, here's a really good example. When naming was first being studied, the initial studies, or some of the initial studies, looked at the differences between 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds or 3-year-olds, whatever it was. And the difference that we were looking for, that they were looking for, was, is this a thing that 2-year-olds typically have? No. Is this a thing that 3-year-olds typically have? Yes. Those are, for the purposes of that study, those were different groups, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. All right. So that allowed us to establish that age might be a critical variable in the natural acquisition of this thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So that can be between children and adults. That can be between typical and developmentally delayed, right? That can be between two groups of typical students. All you have to do is be able to show in some way that there are groups that have this thing and groups that don't.
Right.
All right. Here's a good way of looking at it. There are no studies that establish that a face has 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Right? There's nothing to intervene there. There's no way to have a group that has that and a group that doesn't that can be intervened on. Right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter what those groups are, as long as the difference between the groups is significant. It is significant to the outcome of the study.
Okay. Like I was
All right.
thinking of a dissertation I recently read on audience control,
Mhm.
the social listener reinforcement protocol, using that to induce audience control. And like that made sense to me because they took neurotypical, typically developing kids and then kids that were developmentally delayed and then examine how they acted in across environments. And then that's how they determined that audience control was a thing. But
Is the thing. Yeah.
right, or is is a thing. So but I was wondering, like, if you have a group, a demographic, and they're all developmentally delayed, like in the setting that I work in, I guess I was wondering like how you would compare that. But I understand what you're
Yeah.
saying.
So it's convenient to use neurotypical and delayed kids to demonstrate these differences because there are these inherent delays, right? Where we need to be careful, and that's why some of these studies are so significant, is we need to make sure that the comparison group is capable of acquiring the skill, right? At least when it comes to behavior analytic research, right? So if it's the case that no matter what we do, that difference can't be changed, then either we need to keep studying it, right? Or that is a non-significant variable because it can't be altered, right? So to use my idiotic face example, unless we have, if we have a child that has one eye, one nose, and one mouth, there's no behavioral intervention that is going to induce an eye, right? There might be a medical or a surgical, but that has to be studied in its own right. Okay. A really, really, really good example of this is actually, has anyone read the book Meaningful Differences in the Lives of Everyday American Children? Everyone needs to read that. I'll post that at the end of class. Okay. One of the most significant social studies ever conducted. Have you heard of the concept of the 30 million word gap? Anyone heard that concept before? Okay, so very, very briefly, in the 60s, a lot of money was put into pre-K and kindergarten education. And the goal was to close the educational gap between, for those groups that it existed for. All right, so whether that was race, whether that was socioeconomic status, whether that was gender, whatever it was, the goal was to, here's everyone's starting point, get them all to the same point. And no matter what interventions they use, no matter how many teachers they use, no matter what money they put into it, they could not close that gap, right? So you had a group of high performers and low performers. And we showed that there's a difference between high performers and low performers. But in terms of educational significance of that variable, nothing could be done to close that gap. So there was no, other than continuing to look for something, and they tried a lot of different things, there was not educational significance, or there was not experimental significance in attempting to study what could close that gap from those two groups at that point. All right. So what they did was they went earlier. They looked, I think it's from the ages of 6 months to 2 years or 2.5 years. And they counted the number of words that were spoken. They extrapolated the data out. They counted the number of words that were spoken to those kids and the types of words that were spoken to those kids during that time. And what they found was they found that high socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status was a significant variable, and that children in over a 1.5 year gap or range, students from high socioeconomic status families were just hearing over 30 million more words than students from low socioeconomic status families. All right. So now we have a variable. Can we increase the number of words spoken in low socioeconomic status homes? That is something that can be changed. All right. So those become that's, you know, at the first study, they were studying what looked like the same group, but were really two different groups and looking for differences there. And in the second study, they looked at the same group and showed that there is a difference in a meaningful way. Okay. All right. It's a really, really, really good read. Yes, that's Hart and Risley. Yes, Clarissa. Yeah, cool. So Hart and Risley are the authors, 1992, I think, might be 94. Meaningful Differences in the Lives of Everyday American Children. I'll get that link for you guys at that class. Okay, so that was a long way around dependent talking about dependent and independent variables, but I think that was really, really worth it. What other variables might be able, not always, to synthesize in a lit review? What other aspects of a study might be worth looking at? Take a
maybe
shot. Somebody.
limitations, but I may be thinking too far into it.
Say that again, Heidi. You cut out for just a split second, and it was the most important of them. Say it again.
The limitations, or am I thinking too far into?
Okay, so you're thinking ahead of me, but not in a bad way. So I think that when at the end of any summary of regardless of what portion of your method section it is, at the end of every summary of an article, you need to touch on the limitations, or you should touch on the limitations that the authors identified, so long as they are one of two things: either significant to your study or significant to the significance of that study. So if you're summarizing a study that you believe is going to be like really, really essential to what you are doing, but the authors identified a limitation that really brings into question the validity of their study, you need to show that you are aware of that limitation. You need to show that you have taken that limitation into account of your analysis of that author's work. All right. So let's say you have a study that seems spectacular. It's got great data. The outcomes were really, really good. And the overall research is really meaningful and germane to what you are doing. But maybe their design had some significant flaws to it, or maybe they didn't have a lot of like strong enough IOA. Maybe it was strong enough to get published, but it wasn't really, really robust. And they said, this is a flaw, this needs to be looked at. You kind of have two options in your review of that. One, you could say, I'm going to replicate this exact study and I'm going to take care of that. I am going to do the study that removes that limitation. Clean up the design, get more IOA, measure this variable, use this population, whatever it's going to be. Or you are going to say, well, something along the lines of, well, it's understood that this was a problem in this study. Maybe this other group looked at that. Or we don't believe that it changes the outcome in a meaningful, like it has to be acknowledged in some way. Because otherwise, someone else is going to read that, go to that study and say, well, this article that Heidi used as the central tenet of her study is totally flawed. How can I trust Heidi's outcomes? Heidi didn't address what they identified within their own study. So it becomes a house of cards almost, right? Where you need to make sure that the studies that you build your study on are as strong as possible. And if nothing else, understanding the limitations is really, really important. Addressing them is even better. Good. What else? What other components of your study can be synthesized in the lit review?
So in one of our last classes, Dr. G talked about how you could have the best research question, but if your experimental design isn't arranged appropriately, it's like meaningless. So I guess you could go over the design that you chose and why you need that design in order to study or answer the question you're trying to answer.
Absolutely. And I think that, and I alluded to this earlier, there are a set of basic, well-established behavior analytic designs, and we're going to be going over those in a couple of weeks. And if you're just using a straightforward design, I wouldn't spend any time in your lit review establishing that validity, the validity of the design relative to the question in hand. However, not every question is going to be answered through those standard designs. And there are absolutely times where you are going to have to combine designs or alter designs in ways that are not necessarily as accepted. Finding literature that uses those designs and has been peer reviewed and published is your strongest way of getting through that. That doesn't always get you there though. All right. And I think it's really, really important to understand. The best example that I know of that is the idea of the delayed multiple probe design. And we probably use that tact incorrectly, but it generally looks like this. And if you're just starting off and you don't know exactly what I'm drawing yet, don't worry about it. All right, so this design has been published. You will find this design in published research. All right, these are probably better drawn as bars than dots. You get the idea. All right. However, the journals that use these designs or that these designs have been published in, some of them aren't around anymore. And if you go to publish this design in Java, they will reject you. Even if you cite the research that uses this design. So you have to understand what's the purpose of it, what are its flaws, what are its shortcomings, the articles that were published using this, why did they use it, what did they say about it. There's a lot that goes into using a design other than your more standard designs to ensure that whoever is reviewing it and subsequently reading it trusts your design. Okay, so getting to the point where you are comfortable with the basic designs, comfortable with what each of them provide for, and comfortable with how to manipulate them, at least finding an article that uses a similar type of design and referencing it, reviewing it, talking about how it has been used in the past is going to be helpful to your cause. Good. What else? There's one big one that I'm thinking of. What about your participants? What about your participants as it relates to the topic at hand? All right. Having review of the literature of articles that relate to what you're doing vis-a-vis the participants that they reviewed is, I think, extremely important. We have to have an understanding of, has this been looked at in our current population? Can we reasonably expect to have an effect in the current population? Or is that a variable that we are looking at? If I am doing some research on a study or on an intervention, and I'm tweaking that intervention, and I am doing this study on a population that this general intervention hasn't been looked at before, I now have two moving variables. I have population and I have intervention. I have procedure. That's going to make it very, very challenging for me to establish validity of what I'm doing. Am I getting results or lack of results because of age, because of demographic, because of setting, because of something else? Or am I getting it because of the actual intervention that I changed that or manipulate? All right. So reviewing what the literature says about your topic as it relates to the participant pool that you are working with is also going to be helpful in terms of determining the significance of your study. All right. So in short, not so short, there are multiple components of your actual study, your method section, that might be worth reviewing in some capacity in your lit review. You're never going to just cite an article or summarize an article that gives you the information. It's on you, the writer, experimenter, to bring that meaningful information forward. If I'm doing a study on token economies, but I cite this random article on conditioning, and I cite that article for specifically for the design or for the participants or for whatever, I need to bring that information forward. I need to bring that information to a point where it becomes meaningful to a reader. Okay. Once I have all of those critical pieces of my study put together, now I have to put them all together to start to build my story. And the story that I build, the way that I tell my story, is going to be determined by, at least in part, by the type of research I'm doing and what I'm setting out to show or change or add to. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop there for tonight. I'm going to let Dr. G pick up with that next week. So for next week, I believe the assignment that is due is the annotated bibliography. At this point, the articles that you're reading and summarizing here should absolutely be related to your topic. Don't be picking a topic that you're not going to be writing on. If you're unsure of what you are going to be writing on yet, reach out to me, reach out to Dr. G, whichever one of us is whose sections you're in, and let's get that sorted sooner rather than later. But use that being said, the 10 articles that you review don't have to all end up in your final paper. You can have more, you can have less, you can have different ones, but they should be related to the topic that you are researching. All right. Cool. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
For the annotated bibliography, are we writing it kind of like a lit review, or are we just doing it exactly how we've been doing it, but we're doing 10 of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm looking for something closer to a summary, like a paragraph summary of each article, as you would, including the information that you would put into the summary component of that lit review. So you're not necessarily synthesizing yet, but you want to basically start, the way that I view the annotated bib is what would I say of this article in a lit review? That's how I look at it. Okay. If you write something a little bit different, but it gets you to the same point, that's fine too. It's looking at what is the summary component of that article. Okay.
What are the important parts, but not how they connect together?
Correct. Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Yep. All right. Good question. Anything else? All right. Sounds good. If you're in 593, give yourself about a 10-minute break. Everyone else, I will see you in 2 weeks. Have a good one.